Now, when someone wants to really do something and they want to do it so bad that it becomes the most important thing in their life, then you're looking at someone who is in possession of an enormous amount of energy. Mr. Booker T. Washington was one of those people, and he wanted to get into this particular college so bad that he gave up everything, and he took enormous risk to satisfy that desire. And many people would have given up if they were faced with some of the same obstacles that this man faced. But he didn't bend or break when he faced his trials and tribulations, which we're going to see as we continue reading from the Booker T. Washington collections and his 1901 autobiography, Up from Slavery. Respect.
One day, while at work in the coal mine, I happened to overhear two miners talking about a great school for colored people somewhere in Virginia. This was the first time that I had ever heard anything about any kind of school or college that was more pretentious than the little colored school in our town.
Remember, the families in his community had been using their money to fund their own education. So outside of this, he had never heard of any school that was open to those called colored people. So his ears were wide open at this point. And why were his ears open? Because as he mentioned earlier in this autobiography, as soon as he could think his first thoughts, he had reading on his mind. So literary education was a major part of his natural interest.
In the darkness of the mine, I noiselessly crept as close as I could to the two men who were talking. I heard one tell the other that not only was the school established for the members of any race, but the opportunities that it provided by which poor but worthy students could work out all or a part of the cost of a board, and at the same time be taught some trade or industry. As they went on describing the school, it seemed to me that it must be the greatest place on earth, and not even heaven presented more attractions for me at that time than did the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia, about which these men were talking.
So that gives an idea of just how much this meant to him. It was a greater place than heaven in his mind, and a place where he could satisfy his intense desire to learn.
I resolved at once to go to that school, although I had no idea where it was, or how many miles away, or how I was going to reach it. I remembered only that I was on fire constantly with one ambition, and that was to go to Hampton.
Ambition is a strong personal desire for something. This was the energy or fire that moved him forward, because it seeks manifestation on the physical plane, somehow and some way. And when the desire is burning like it was in Mr. Washington, a person doesn't require to know all the details before moving toward a goal. They just start moving and figuring things out as they go along.
This thought was with me day and night.
What thought? The thought on how he would get his behind over to the Hampton Institute.
After hearing of the Hampton Institute, I continued to work for a few months longer in the coal mine. While at work there, I heard of a vacant position in the household of General Lewis Ruffner, the owner of the salt furnace and coal mine. Mrs. Viola Ruffner, the wife of General Ruffner, was a Yankee woman from Vermont.
This was a woman who had a reputation for being very strict on the servants that worked for her. Most people, he says, didn't last longer than 2 or 3 weeks because of how strict she was. She wanted everything kept clean and dust-free at all times, and she wanted things done properly, promptly, and orderly. Nothing sloppy or haphazardly. So Mr. Washington took his chance and hired under her for $5 a month. Then he quickly became familiar with her expectations and the importance of her demands, which eventually rubbed off on him and would be of much value, as we'll see later in his journey.
From fearing Mrs. Ruffner, I soon learned to look upon her as one of my best friends. When she found that she could trust me, she did so implicitly. During the 1 or 2 winters that I was with her, she gave me an opportunity to go to school for an hour in the day during a portion of the winter months. But most of my studying was done at night, sometimes alone, sometimes under someone who I could hire to teach me. Mrs. Ruffner always encouraged and sympathized with me in all my efforts to get an education. It was while living with her that I began to get together my first library.
Here we go.
I secured a dry goods box, knocked out one side of it, put some shelves in it, and began putting into it every kind of book that I could get my hands upon, and called it my library. Notwithstanding my success at Mrs. Ruffner's, I did not give up the idea of going to the Hampton Institute. In the fall of 1872, I determined to make an effort to get there, although, as I have stated, I had no definite idea of the direction in which Hampton was, or of what it would cost to go there.
And as I have stated, none of that mattered, because a desire of the sort that he had comes from the innermost, which is connected to all that is. So when the ambition burns hot like this, there's no need to have a detailed plan, because one's already laid out. The intellect is the part of the self that wants to know every detail before making the move. But many times, a detailed plan is not possible, as in the case of Mr. Washington. So the intellectual self has to be pushed to the side and take a backseat and allow faith and intuition to lead the way. Right? Understand and pay attention.
I do not think that anyone thoroughly sympathized with me in my ambition to go to Hampton unless it was my mother, and she was troubled with a grave fear that I was starting out on a wild goose chase. At any rate, I got only a half-hearted consent from her that I might start. The small amount of money that I had earned had been consumed by my stepfather and the remainder of the family, with the exception of a very few dollars, and so I had very little with which to buy clothes and pay my traveling expenses. My brother John helped me all that he could, but of course that was not a great deal, for his work was in the coal mine where he did not earn much, and most of what he did earn went in the direction of paying the household expenses. Perhaps the thing that touched and pleased me most in connection with my starting for Hampton was the interest that many of the older colored people took in the matter. They had spent the best days of their lives in slavery, and hardly expected to live to see the time when they would see a member of their race leave home to attend a boarding school. Some of these older people would give me a nickel, others a quarter, or a handkerchief.
It may not have been much, but at least it was something, along with their support.
Finally, the great day came, and I started for Hampton.
Uh-oh.
I had only a small, cheap satchel that contained a few articles of clothing I could get. My mother at the time was rather weak and broken in health. I hardly expected to see her again, and thus our parting was all the more sad. She, however, was very brave through it all.
You see how serious this was to him? His mother was weak and sick, and he still made the decision to leave. Now, how many of us would have done the same thing? Think about what's happening here and his level of dedication.
At that time, there were no through trains connecting that part of West Virginia with Eastern Virginia. Trains ran only a portion of the way, and the remainder of the distance was traveled by stage coaches. The distance from Malden to Hampton is about 500 miles,
which is a great distance without an automobile or a plane. They had stage coaches, which were carried by horses, and would have taken just over a week to make this trip.
I had not been away from home many hours before it began to grow painfully evident that I did not have enough money to pay my fare to Hampton.
So how in the world is he going to make it to Hampton without the money to do so? We shall see.
One experience I shall long remember. I had been traveling over the mountains most of the afternoon in an old-fashioned stagecoach when, late in the evening, the coach stopped for the night at a common, unpainted house called a hotel. All the other passengers except myself were whites. In my ignorance, I supposed that the little hotel existed for the purpose of accommodating the passengers who traveled on the stagecoach. The difference that the color of one's skin would make I had not thought anything about. After all the other passengers had been shown rooms and were getting ready for supper, I shyly presented myself before the man at the desk. It is true I had practically no money in my pocket with which to pay for bed or food, but I had hoped in some way to beg my way into the good graces of the landlord, for at that season in the mountains of Virginia, the weather was cold, and I wanted to get indoors for the night. Without asking as to whether I had any money, The man at the desk firmly refused to even consider the matter of providing me with food or lodging.
That's the authentic white consciousness that manifested at that time. It didn't care that another human was cold and without food. It only cared that he didn't have a certain skin pigmentation. And because of that, he firmly refused to even consider his situation. Do you see how childish the skin color thing is?
This was my first experience in finding out what the color of my skin meant.
This was the first time he realized that his brown skin was despised.
In some way, I managed to keep warm by walking about, and so got through the night. My whole soul was so bent upon reaching Hampton that I did not have time to cherish any bitterness toward the hotel keeper.
He didn't have any room in his mind to think about the childish behavior of the white hotel keeper. All of his mental capacity was occupied with the thought of getting to Hampton. The same thought he had been thinking about day and night for years, as he mentioned earlier.
By walking, begging rides both in wagons and in the cars, in some way, after a number of days, I reached the city of Richmond, Virginia, about 82 miles from Hampton.
Remember, he didn't have enough money to fund the entire trip, and he didn't know how he was going to get there. So one of the tools he used was begging, right? He begged for rides, and after a number of days, he found himself in the city of Richmond, Virginia.
When I reached there, tired, hungry, and dirty, it was late in the night. I had never been in a large city, and this rather added to my misery. When I reached Richmond, I was completely out of money. I had not a single acquaintance in the place, and, being unused to city ways, I did not know where to go.
Uh-oh. And this is where panic could set in if he didn't control the intellectual self, who seeks to know all the details before a move can be made.
I applied at several places for lodging, but they all wanted money, and that was what I did not have. Knowing nothing else better to do, I walked the streets. In doing this, I passed by many a food stands where fried chicken and half-moon apple pies were piled high and made to present a most tempting appearance. At that time, it seemed to me that I would have promised all that I expected to possess in the future to have gotten hold of one of those chicken legs or one of those pies.
He would have nearly sold his soul to the devil to get a hold of one of those chicken legs or pies. This stuff is wild, isn't it?
But I could not get either of these, nor anything else to eat. I must have walked the streets till after midnight. At last I became so exhausted that I could walk no longer. I was tired, I was hungry, I was everything but discouraged. Just about the time when reached extreme physical exhaustion, I came upon a portion of a street where the board sidewalk was considerably elevated. I waited for a few minutes till I was sure that no passers-by could see me, and then crept under the sidewalk and lay for the night upon the ground, with my satchel of clothing for a pillow. Nearly all night I could hear the tramp of feet over my head. The next morning I found myself somewhat refreshed, but I was extremely hungry, because it had been a long time since I had had sufficient food. As soon as it became light enough for me to see my surroundings, I noticed that I was near a large ship, and that this ship seemed to be unloading a cargo of pig iron.
Remember I told you that the innermost self has the plan and knows what it's doing? It had him walk and stumble into a particular spot where he could sleep, and then wake up right next to a cargo ship that had what to do with his journey. Let's find out.
I went at once to the vessel and asked the captain to permit me to help unload the vessel in order to get money for food. The captain, a white man who seemed to be kind-hearted, consented I worked long enough to earn money for my breakfast, and it seems to me, as I remember it now, to have been about the best breakfast that I have ever eaten. My work pleased the captain so well that he told me if I desired I could continue working for a small amount per day. This I was very glad to do. I continued working on this vessel for a number of days.
You see that? The intellectual mind could have never planned this out, because it does a horrible job at accounting for spontaneous types of predicaments. This is coming from the innermost self that's connected to all and can account for these types of situations. And get this man probably really needed the help that day to unload the vessel. and was just as glad to hire Mr. Washington as Mr. Washington was to be hired by him. So it worked out for both of them in their own storyline taking place at the same time. But all of this we're hearing about is primarily the function of faith and intuition, which are leading the way to manifest this strong desire he has.
After buying food with the small wages I received, there was not much left to add on the amount I must get to pay my way to Hampton. In order to economize in every way possible, so as to be sure to reach Hampton in a reasonable time, I continued to sleep under the same sidewalk that gave me shelter the first night I was in Richmond. Many years after that, the colored citizens of Richmond very kindly tendered me a reception, at which there must have been 2,000 people present. This reception was held not far from the spot where I slept the first night I spent in the city, and I must confess that my mind was more upon the sidewalk that first gave me shelter than upon the recognition, agreeable and cordial as it was. When I had saved what I considered enough money with which to reach Hampton, I thanked the captain of the vessel for his kindness, and started again.
And look at that. Now all of a sudden he has the rest of the money to pay for the remainder of the trip. Do you see what's taking place? He started with no money, no plan, and only a strong desire. Now going through the journey, we see him pushing forward to overcome these obstacles and essentially following the invisible plan that already existed for him.
Without any unusual occurrence, I reached Hampton, with a surplus of exactly 50 cents with which to begin my education.
Come on with it.
To me it had been a long, eventful journey, but the first sight of the large 3-story brick school building seemed to have rewarded me for all that I had undergone in order to reach the place. If the people who gave the money to provide that building could appreciate the influence the sight of it had upon me, as well as upon thousands of other youths, they would feel all the more encouraged to make such gifts. It seemed to me to be the largest and most beautiful building I had ever seen. The sight of it seemed to give me new life. I felt that a new kind of existence had now begun. That life would now have a new meaning. I felt that I had reached the promised land, and I resolved to let no obstacle prevent me from putting forth the highest effort to fit myself to accomplish the most good in the world.
He climbed his way out of one pit to get into his paradise, or he made the exodus out of Egypt to get into the promised land. This is what we're hearing about.
As soon as possible after reaching the grounds of the Hampton Institute, I presented myself before the head teacher for an assignment to a class. Having been so long without proper food, a bath, and a change of clothing, I did not, of course, make a very favorable impression upon her, and I could see at once that there were doubts in her mind about the wisdom of admitting me as a student. I felt that I could hardly blame her if she got the idea that I was a worthless loafer or tramp. For some time she did not refuse to admit me, neither did she decide in my favor, and I continued to linger about her, and to impress her in all the ways I could with my worthiness. In the meantime I saw her admitting other students, and that added greatly to my discomfort, for I felt deep down in my heart that I could do as well as they, if I could only get a chance to show what was in me. After some hours had passed, the head teacher said to me, "The adjoining recitation room needs sweeping. Take the broom and sweep it."
Pay attention here.
It occurred to me at once that here was my chance. Never did I receive an order with more delight. I knew that I could sweep, for Mrs. Ruffner had thoroughly taught me how to do that when I lived with her.
Remember, he had spent those couple of years with the woman who was strict and wanted everything clean at all times? That training he received during that time was a preparation for this part of his journey, which he would have never known, right? This is how the inner world works, and you've got to understand how to put yourself in alignment with it, like we see Mr. Washington doing on his journey. So the head teacher asked him to sweep, and he jumped on this quickly because he was already trained in this skill.
I swept the recitation room 3 times. Then I got a dusting cloth and dusted it 4 times. All the woodwork around the walls, every bench, table, and desk, I went over 4 times with my dusting cloth. Besides, Every piece of furniture had been moved and every closet and corner in the room had been thoroughly cleaned. I had the feeling that in a large measure my future depended upon the impression I made upon the teacher in the cleaning of that room. When I was through, I reported to the head teacher. She was a Yankee woman who knew just where to look for dirt.
She was just like the strict Yankee Miss Ruffner, who he learned from before arriving at Hampton.
She went into the room and inspected the floor and closets. Then she took her handkerchief and rubbed it on the woodwork about the walls and over the table and benches. When she was unable to find one bit of dirt on the floor or a particle of dust on any of the furniture, she quietly remarked, "I guess you will do to enter this institution." I was one of the happiest souls on earth. The sweeping of that room was my college examination, and never did any youth pass an examination for entrance into Harvard or Yale that gave him more genuine satisfaction. I have passed several examinations since then, but I have always felt that this was the best one I ever passed. I have spoken of my own experience in entering the Hampton Institute. Perhaps few, if any, had anything like the same experience that I had, but about the same period there were hundreds who found their way to Hampton and other institutions after experiencing something of the same difficulties that I went through. The young men and women were determined to secure an education at any cost. The sweeping of the recitation room in the manner that I did, it seems to have paved the way for me to get through Hampton. Miss Mary F. Mackey, the head teacher, offered me a position as janitor.
Oh, snaps. This stuff is magical, isn't it? Now a position offered to him as a janitor? What does that mean for him? A way to earn money while going to school. Could the intellectual mind have ever planned any of this out? No, but the innermost self certainly could.
This, of course, I gladly accepted, because it was a place where I could work out nearly all the cost of my board. The work was hard and taxing, but I stuck to it. I had a large number of rooms to care for and had to work late into the night, while at the same time I had to rise by 4 o'clock in the morning in order to build the fires and have a little time in which to prepare my lessons. In all my career at Hampton, and ever since I have been out in the world, Miss Mary F. Mackey, the head teacher to whom I have referred, proved one of my strongest and most helpful friends. Her advice and encouragement were always helpful in strengthening to me in the darkest hour. After having been for a while at Hampton, I found myself in difficulty because I did not have books and clothing.
It just keeps going, hurdle after hurdle, until he either breaks or overcomes, either one.
Usually, however, I got around the trouble about books by borrowing from those who were more fortunate than myself. As to clothes, when I reached Hampton, I had practically nothing. Everything that I possessed was in a small hand satchel. My anxiety about clothing was increased because of the fact that General Armstrong made a personal inspection of the young men in ranks to see that their clothes were clean. Shoes had to be polished, there must be no buttons off the clothing, and no grease spots. To wear one suit of clothes continually, while at work and in the schoolroom, and at the same time keep it clean, was rather a hard problem for me to solve. In some way I managed to get on till the teachers learned that I was in earnest and meant to succeed, and then some of them were kind enough to see that I was partly supplied with second-hand clothing that had been sent in barrels from the north. These barrels proved a blessing to hundreds of poor but deserving students. Without them, I question whether I should ever have gotten through Hampton.
So with all these problems he faced, the solutions seemed to just appear out of nowhere. But the reality is, when a person is doing what they're meant to do, and they have aligned their inner and outer worlds, they should expect these things to fall in place and eventually reach a point where it no longer becomes some type of surprise, right? And this applies to all humans. Nobody's more special than anyone else. It's just that some people, like Mr. Booker T. Washington, don't let fear and anxiety stop them from doing what they're supposed to do, because he most certainly felt those emotions, but he pushed through and he was rewarded for doing so. Now, what would have happened if he would have given up and turned back on any part of his journey? He would have never made it to the promised land, right? Because there's always at least some aspects of a person that fears the journey and wants to return to the familiarity of Egypt, right? But there's other aspects that push forward and never look back. Okay? So we'll stop right here and we'll pick up in the next commentary. And so I want to thank you right now for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.